This is another program in the Exchange series. Today, we meet and talk with some pioneers in continuing education. The pioneers are Dr. J.M.C. Duckworth and Dr. Ernest Stabler in conversation with Dr. Roby Kidd of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. All have been identified with the YMCA, which has been serving Canadian communities since. Dr. Jack Duckworth is known from Vancouver, where he entered YMCA work in 1920, to Halifax, where he retired as Y General Secretary. In between, Jack worked in Montreal, particularly at Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. He has degrees from McGill University, Union Theological Seminary at Columbia, and an honorary doctorate from Acadia. Ernest Stabler served as a staff member with Jack Duckworth at Montreal's NDG. Now on the faculty at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, Dr. Stabler has held posts in universities in Canada and the United States and has had overseas appointments. Roby Kidd started as a YMCA secretary in 1935 and was a staff member with Jack Duckworth at Montreal's NDG also. Now chairman of the Adult Education Department of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, Roby has been associated with Canadian and international adult education projects. We join Roby Kidd and Ernie Stabler as they talk with Jack Duckworth about developments in continuing education, recognizing that many educators started during the era of service of these men.
Dr. E.A. Corbett, the former director of the CAAE, used to say that the early pioneers of adult education had, many of them at least, come from the church. He used to speak of himself as having set out on the road to Damascus and had fallen amongst educators. I guess, Jack Duckworth, that you were one of those who became interested in education and recreation in relation to the development of character and personality. Would that be correct?
Yes. In 1920, I identified myself with the professional staff of the YMCA in Vancouver. And at that time, it was a very serious business with me. I had just recently joined the church, took it very seriously, found out that the purpose of the association was the development of Christian character and the building of a Christian society, and I was very anxious to have a part in that.
You went on from Vancouver to Montreal, I believe.
Yes, to go to the university, but I worked with the YMCA the whole time I was at the university.
Jack, who were your models? Who were the people that you respected most and thought very highly of in those days?
Well, they were YMCA men who, in the present time, are regarded as giants, I guess, of the movement. Dr. John R. Mott, Fletcher Brockman, E.T. Colton, men of the caliber of Tracy Strong, who then was the Boys' Work Secretary of the Seattle YMCA, and men of this caliber meant a great deal to me because of the way in which they spoke and the way in which they challenged us in those days to make a use of our lives and to shape the characters of other people and change society.
For a lot of people, the YMCA used to be thought of as a gym or a swimming pool. When I went to see you first, there wasn't a pool or a gym within miles. There you were working out in a field, in a community. This seemed unusual, and was it unique then?
Well, I think probably it was. Your own brother was one of the first who associated himself with me in a professional way around the YMCA. We bought a 3.5 acre lot. It was filled with bramble bushes and rocks and trees. And we began to talk with each other about how we could draw elements in the community towards this area. And we began without any facilities whatsoever, spent our whole time working with people who we met in the community, young people, children, adults, and in that way got our start in the work.
This was in the west end of Montreal?
Yes, an area called Notre-Dame-de-Grâce,
right,
which carried on without a building of any kind there except a small wooden shack in which people changed clothes and we stored tools and recreation equipment. for many years, from 1928, when that property was purchased, until 1939, when the building was opened. We went along without any facilities other than very crude shacks.
I think I was very impressed, since I knew something about work with young people, with the fact that you had boys and girls, you had youth of both sexes, you had people of all ages working with you and taking part in activities.
Well, yes, this was because of a conviction that I had that the YMCA ought to be working with the whole family instead of with just boys. I picked up this idea from watching what happened by YMCA program people in the war, First World War. And I soon discovered that girls were as interested in activities around the YMCA as boys were. And not only because of the sex appeal, but because there was something for them to do and something of interest for them to do. And we very soon got onto the idea that if the YMCA was to bring about character changes in a meaningful way, that it would probably be reinforced and made most definite if it happened in the family relationship that the boy held or that the girl held.
And that's why then, when you built the new building, you planned it for everybody in the family, and not just activities for different groups, but to be shared in by the whole family and the community.
Well, yes, the whole family and the community. I think it's important to remember that you yourselves were participants in this program at one time or another, very early in the thing. To remember that if you're going to do a job with the community, the unit to work with is the family, and if you're going to do a good job with the family, that you have to recognize what's going on in the community and deal with the factors that are operating there. We learned that very early.
It struck me, though, that you, when we were with you in the early 40s, you were influencing the lives of people in many different ways. I don't mean you particularly, although you did, but the YMCA as an institution. Badminton and swimming and hockey and softball and religious experience and intellectual experience. I can remember a book club that was a thriving enterprise in the NDG YMCA. It wasn't just the whole family, but it was the lives of people in several different dimensions. Is this true?
Oh, yes, that's very true. Of course, it would differ with one family and another family, but all these emphases you made from the point of view of those of us who were starting this enterprise were significant factors, and that there wasn't any one particular factor that was more important than another. A man's physical activities was no more important in our minds than his mental and spiritual activities, and vice versa. The spiritual activities were just as important as the physical activities. Most people, as you have said, associated the YMCA with physical activities, because I think the YMCA became quite widely known, particularly in the First World War, because of the great recreation programs that it conducted for men in the services. But this idea of working with the family involved all ages and all sexes and all aspects of their interests, which made it possible, of course, to have a very rich program going on if you had the caliber of people that you required to put it across. And we had a very small actual professional staff. We counted very largely on volunteers. And that in itself is an interesting thing, because I think whereas everybody in those days was talking about group work and discussion groups as the basis of getting at character changes, I think those of us who were behind the scenes as well as out in the forefront of this work were convinced that what you did with an individual person was of basic importance. And if you wanted success within the groups, you did something of importance with the people who composed that group, and you didn't just count upon the influence of the group to make the changes.
Seems to me, too, that you tried to get people at the moments when life was fascinating and terrifying or exciting to them, For example, you used, as I recall it, to get groups of boys after a hockey game to reflect on what had gone on. They didn't just get sore heads and go off or yelling at each other or the referee, but they thought about what had occurred and learned from the experience when it was most gripping to them.
Well, yes, we did some of that. I think we didn't do probably as much of that as we might have done, but we did some of that with some very good results at times. But of course, youngsters and adults both get so worked up in these competitions if they're really out there to win a championship or something of that sort, that it's pretty hard to get them to sit down and to discuss those things at that particular time. But we had referees and discussion group leaders who were aware of these issues, and they sensed, I think, all of us sensed that it is at these moments when you really get your wax in if you're going to make an impression on a man. His behavior is thus and so here. Well, then the time to reflect on it is right then and there, or shortly after. Or if you don't, you make a note of it so that when you get the opportunity to review it with him when he's willing to talk to you. But I've seen that happen with, well, for example, yourself in trying to build courage into a youngster who was fearful of the water. You remember sitting on the edge of the pool with the youngster. And when you got his confidence, he would get into the water with you, but it was a long time sometimes before he got into the water, unless he had your confidence, unless you instilled it in him.
Jack, I'm struck with this idea that your concern, and I remember working with you, and this I noticed then, your concern was to get through to the individual, not necessarily to regard a program as successful if it had lots of group activity. The work that you did in writing to servicemen overseas during the war, this was a very personalized thing. Is it fair to say that you constantly tried to break through the barriers of communication and reach the individual?
Oh, well, yes, I think so. This is a thing that's a little bit sensitive to talk about, you know, because so many people react in so many different ways about this approach. But I really believe that it's fundamental to the whole business of getting character change and actually getting people to accept a challenge to respond in a certain way and to undertake service, for example, in their community, or to organize and get activities running in the community. If you're going to get that done, I think it's because you've had success in prevailing upon an individual. Now, you can't do that, I don't think. At least I thought in those days that you couldn't get that done through some resolution that might be arrived at after a group discussion. Important as those group discussions often were, and I believe that that's a method that is very valuable. Still, I think the fundamental thing was how you relate to people.
And yet here, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but here was the first example I remember where there was a good community council. There were about 40 organizations which dealt with people in specific ways around a part of their interest. And you found a way of bringing them together to get some focused attention to the problems of the whole community as well as the individuals. And as I remembered, you didn't see these as being competitive at all, but complementary ways of achieving the same goal.
Yes, of course, that came some years after I had been in the community, and I think it's important for people who are talking about adult education to remember that some of the most important things that happened in those years didn't come about at the beginning of the experience or in the middle of the experience, but after you'd been there for 5 years and people had confidence in you or knew what you were driving at or believed in you, even if they didn't understand you, they believed in you. And this community council didn't come about until around about 1945, which was some years after we had been operating in the community. Of course, the confidence had been built up, but these letters to men overseas were addressed to young fellows who I had grown up with, to boys that I had related to. I was anywhere from 10 to 20 years older than they were, but there had been a growth in that community, a joyous growth. We all lived together, played together, saw a lot of each other day in and day out. Those days, too, should be remembered as days when the great hunger days were on, the days of unemployment,
Depression.
The Great Depression, and a boy hadn't a dime in his pocket. And in the wintertime, they'd shovel snow for $25 an hour in storms, you know.
25 cents an hour.
25 cents an hour, I mean, yeah. Those were the days. Well, now, it was as a result of growing up together, parents would come and girls and boys would come around rinks or recreation programs, bonfire programs, whatever we were going, and saw a lot of each other. So when you came to this other phase of the thing, you're talking about community council, it was obvious by that date that there were a number of organizations working at odds because they weren't aware of the other organization in the community. We didn't know what they stood for. And this is what brought us together. And there were some amazing things grew out of that community council. I'd like to point out that this was a role I think the YMCA played in that community, a very effective role. All the meetings were held in the YMCA building. The staff was loaned to the organization for secretarial purposes and so on. And the plans which were discussed as needs in the community were all revealed in this setting in the YMCA. But then these people would meet once a month, all these 30 organizations, representatives from each of these organizations, and clear with each other about what were the major problems going on in the community, delinquency or traffic problems, or trying to set up a tavern in a residential community where it wasn't wanted.
Or new housing.
Or new housing for veterans and things like this. And we just battered this right out. And there was a lot of press coverage. There had been nothing of the kind established in the city of Montreal prior to that date of this kind. And it had a number of repercussions. We got a wonderful children's library out of this. We'd never had a library in that community before, and there was something like 60,000 people in that community.
So you were the agent, the catalytic agent, the animating force that really brought the organizations together and helped to create a sense of community. Not you, if you would be modest enough to say the YMCA did this.
I'd be modest enough to say that I think it was people associated with me in the YMCA, staff people and volunteers. And there had been a great number of outstanding volunteers, businessmen and school teachers and newspaper people and recreation leaders and others, church people, Sunday school leaders and so forth, who identified themselves with this type of program around the YMCA.
And who've done many different kinds of things together.
Together, yeah.
Together.
This is it, together.
And develop kind of trust in each other as well as in you and your staff.
Yeah, this is right. This is right.
And this means that a man really ought to stay there for some time before this kind of trust and confidence is built up. You were 20 years there.
Yes.
You couldn't have done this in 5.
Oh, I doubt it very much.
20 is an important component in this, then.
I think that if a staff man is to be effective in adult education, that he's got to be in the community long enough so that the people recognize that he's not a fly-by-night fellow, that he's there seriously to try to be helpful to them, and that he wants to enter into their problems if he's wanted to be helpful in the degree that he can. And well, I'm positive you can't really affect much that's going to be permanent unless you're prepared at least to stay 5 years. I think you begin to build in a constructive way in your 10th year and in your 15th year. They'd call you Mr. So-and-so in the community by that time. You know, they knew you. You came to their homes. They knew right away who you were, what it was all about.
But Jack, over that period, 20 years now, in Western English-speaking residential Montreal, is it fair to say that you didn't take just a social work approach or a community development approach? Am I right in thinking that the basic springs of your efforts were religious? I remember, for example, you saying one day as we worked together that if a day went by in which you did not do something that you felt was furthering the will of God, you did not feel that that day had been well spent. I've always remembered that. Is that a fair reflection of your outlook?
Yeah, I believe that very sincerely.
Yes.
And I try to work at it with a lot of failures, I think, but I really try to work at it. This is what I was trying to get at the beginning, that if there's to be an adult education program, there has to be some high purpose motivating you in what you're trying to do through this program. This is one of the things that I think we need to examine today. Just what are the values that we think are important or sacred or of such consequence that you must commit yourself to those values.
I was remembering another public of yours, whom you met as individuals, these wealthy men, heads of corporations, whom you would educate to the point where they were ready to give some support for these things too, by helping them see what they could do with.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether you can say I educated them. There might have been some persuasion at times about this, but I do think it's fair to say that you really haven't got the right to approach a businessman or an influential citizen or a moneyed person unless, A, you were motivated by pretty important ideals.
Or even to ask anyone to invest their time.
Yes, or even to ask them to invest their time.
You have to believe in your own cause.
You have to believe in your own cause, and you have to be sincere about it. I mean, to say, you gave them a chance to find out whether you really were practicing what you were preaching. If you took their money or asked them for service, then you went back at them next year when they'd say, when you'd say, well, Mr. X, how did this appeal to you over the last year, what we've done with your money?
Yep.
Or you'd go to a leader and you'd say, well, have you had satisfaction in your work this year? I think some of the finest things that happened around our YMCA adult education work was the staff conferences that we had, when we would review problems that came up that were affecting individual people or clubs or groups, and have those things all thrashed out so that we knew that we could go to a man who was a leader in the community and say to him, look, this is what has been happening. These are the people that are working, and these are the results that we're getting. Don't you feel that this is important to give financial assistance to this? And the response was really very satisfactory.
You were also always interested, not just what was happening in your own neighborhood, but with ideas